Welcome to History Nest, where the past whispers you to sleep. Imagine this: on a winter night in 1457 AD, the sound of a girl's scream reverberates through the stone hallways of Beaufort Castle. Like a razor through silk, the sound pierces the howling wind. Lady Margaret Beaufort, 13, clutches the bloody blankets under her in a room with just flickering candles for light, her tiny body trembling with an agony no child should ever experience. The midwives, their faces solemn in the whirling shadows, murmur prayers in Latin. Outside, snow falls on Bedfordshire's frozen landscape. However, a girl who is barely out of childhood is being ripped away from a future King of England within this room. As Margaret Orban experiences yet another wave of misery, her hair clings to her sweat-drenched face. They believe she is dying. Her hips are too thin, and the baby is too big. Her body is still developing at the age of 13. Here, however, she works to bear the son who will eventually become Henry VII, the heir to the English crown. No one in the room understands the irony. This child will put a stop to the bloodiest war in English history and establish the Tudor dynasty, which will change the course of history. If you love learning about the hidden facts of history, think about clicking the like button and subscribing for more content like this before delving into these lost tales of survival and pain. Additionally, kindly let me know where you're listening by leaving a comment below. It's amazing to me that we're studying these old tales from around the globe together, bound together by our mutual interest in the past and transcending time and location. It was no typical noble damsel who was writhing in that bed. The blood of kings, namely that of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, fourth son of Edward III, was infused into Lady Margaret Beaufort's veins. However, Margaret would discover throughout her remarkable life that royal blood could be both a boon and a bane. Such bloodlines made you either a valuable pawn or a deadly threat in the brutal political climate of 15th century England, where the Wars of the Roses would soon split the nation. Years ago, when she was still a child playing in Beaufort Castle's grounds, Margaret's journey to that delivery room began. She came into a world where alliances changed like sand, and marriage was the most powerful tool of statecraft when she was born in May of 1443 AD to John Beaufort, the first Duke of Somerset, and Margaret Beauchamp of Blue. When she was just a year old, her father passed away. Some claim that he broke and degraded himself after military failures in France. Others whispered of poison, for back then, like vultures trailing an army, rumors of poison accompanied every sudden death of the nobles. Margaret's early years were plagued by the events surrounding John Beaufort's death. During the last stages of the 100 Years' War, he had led English forces in France and watched in despair as Henry V's gains were gradually taken away. The military mishaps consumed him like a malignancy. Courtiers observed his shaky hands and lifeless eyes upon his return to England in 1444 AD. He ate less, talked less, and stared at nothing for hours on end. He was discovered dead in his quarters at Wimborne Minster on May 27, 1444 AD. Those closest to him were aware that the official cause was fever. John Beaufort had chosen death over dishonor, whether it was by blade, poison, or just the weight of failure. Margaret's mother did not spend any time protecting the future of her daughter. In a society where women and children were only worth the relationships they could forge, the Dogger Duchess Margaret Beauchamp knew the laws of survival. Little Margaret was engaged to John de Pole, son of William de Pole, Duke of Suffolk, by the time she was 6 years old. Two of the most influential families in England were bound by the contract in what appeared to be an unbreakable relationship. However, politics outpaced youth, and that betrothal was reduced to useless paper when Suffolk lost favor and was killed in 1450 AD while traveling across the English Channel. Negotiating Henry V's marriage to Margaret of Anjou and Maine and Anjou's capitulation to France had been Suffolk's crime, words that infuriated both the common people and the English nobles. Even by the time's standards, his death was horrific, dragged from his ship by political rivals or pirates. He had to kneel on the gun barrel as one of his captors used a rusty sword to cut off his head, which took 6 awkward strokes. The Beaufort ladies discovered early on that adaptation was necessary for survival. She quickly betrayed Edmund, Earl of Richmond, who was King Henry V's half-brother, through his mother's marriage to Owen Tudor. The Welsh upstarts, known as the Tudors, had dubious legality. However, the king's favor was the one thing that mattered more to them than long-standing bloodlines. Henry V's widow, Catherine of Valois, had taken an interest in Owen Tudor, a royal officer. Although the nobles had been scandalized by their covert marriage, Henry V recognized and promoted their 2 sons, Edmund and Jasper Tudor, to the position of peerage. Margaret was married to Edmund Tudor in 1455 AD when she was just 12 years old. The ceremony sealed political connections with words of love she could hardly comprehend and vows that would bind her to an unimaginable future. Bleau Castle, the same fortress where Margaret had grown up, served as the venue for the wedding. Her grandfather, John Beaufort, Earl of Somerset, was buried in the chapel where they exchanged vows, and the great hall was embellished with tapestries that showed the actions of her Beaufort ancestors. Edmund Tudor was a 20-something man with political and military experience. Margaret's childhood clothing was still too small for her. The union was consummated right away. When noble girls were viewed as potential dynastic heirs, there was no such thing as waiting for physical maturation. Margaret never mentioned the wedding night horror in her subsequent years. However, the irreparable harm to her body and her lifelong, almost obsessive, religious commitment would be the testaments to its impact. Margaret's body started changing in ways that scared her impressionable mind within months of her wedding. Her condition was discussed in low tones by the elder ladies in her immediate vicinity, whose expressions mixed happiness for a prospective heir with worry for a young mother. Margaret's own mother was extremely anxious when she observed her daughter's expanding tummy. When Margaret was born, she was 18, old enough to safely endure childbirth. Margaret, who would soon turn 13, was trying to do something that had killed many women who were older and stronger than her. Edmund Tudor, however, would never see the birth of his child. He was taken at Carmarthen Castle in the autumn of 1456 AD while on a campaign against Yorkist forces in Wales. The circumstances surrounding his apprehension and eventual demise are still unclear, shrouded in political intrigue and civil strife. According to some reports, he was captured during a surprise attack when his troops were dispersed throughout South Wales. Betrayal from inside his own ranks is hinted at by others. One of history's unanswered questions is whether he was killed by his captors or perished from the epidemic in his confinement. His captors found the epidemic excuse convenient. Medieval jails were notorious for disease, and claiming natural death evaded accusations of killing a royal half-brother. However, modern chroniclers observed that his decline was suspiciously rapid and that his prisoners would not permit doctors to treat him. We do know that by November of 1456, a 13-year-old Margaret was pregnant, a widow, and completely alone in a world on the verge of civil war. Margaret, who had been staying at Lampthe Palace in Pembrokeshire while her husband was on the campaign trail, learnt of Edmund's passing. On a soggy November evening, the messenger arrived, his horse drenched from the frantic journey across Wales. The sound of the messenger's boots reverberated on the stone floor behind Margaret, who was praying for her husband's safe return in the palace chapel. Her world was devastated before he even spoke. Edmund's younger brother, Jasper Tuda, assumed responsibility for his sister-in-law's pregnancy. The choice was sensible as well as chivalrous. The kid Margaret carried might carry on their family's royal ties and be the heir to the Tuda line. He took her to his fortress at Pembroke Castle in Wales, where the enormous stone walls provided shelter from the escalating mayhem outside. Perched on cliffs above Milford Haven, where the Atlantic waves beat relentlessly against the rocks below, Pembroke was a castle on the edge of the world. Margaret would go through the most terrifying incident of her early life here in this isolated Welsh castle. In her advanced pregnancy, the trip to Pembroke was a hardship in and of itself. Winter highways were obstructed by fallen branches and rutted with frozen mud, making them hardly usable. Margaret's swelling frame hurt with every bump and jolt. As she rode in a horse-drawn litter, after navigating around flooded rivers and dodging groups of armed men whose allegiances were uncertain, the trip that should have lasted 2 days ended up taking 5. Constructed on a limestone rock above the Pembroke River, Pembroke Castle served as a harsh haven during the winter months. For miles around, the castle dominated the countryside. For 3 centuries, its magnificent round keep, which was almost 80 feet high, had resisted storms and sieges, but it was not for comfort, it was survival. Great fireplaces that consumed wood more quickly than servants could provide it were the only source of warmth in the chilly and drafty Lass castle rooms. To keep out the wind that blew through all the crevices in the old stones, Margaret's apartments were covered with heavy tapestries. In particular, the winter of 1456 to 1457 AD was harsh. The sea wind howled through every crevice in the old stones, and ice formed on the interior of the castle windows. Margaret's bloated belly from having a child made it difficult for her to move around her room without getting tired. The weight it carried caused her body, which was still very much that of a child, to struggle. She was inspected with increasing worry by the castle's physician, a learnt man who had attended the universities of Oxford and Paris. He told Jasper Tuda that her hips were too thin, the child was not in a good posture. Birth would be risky, possibly lethal. A guy named Dr. Louis Carleon had given birth to both peasants and queens. He had 40 years of experience in the healing arts, had read the ancient writings of Galen and Hippocrates, and had heard lectures by the brightest minds in medicine. All of his education, however, seemed insufficient as he examined the pregnant kid under his care. Margaret's pelvis was still growing. She was still developing. Her fetus was big, misaligned, and displaying symptoms of distress. In the castle, Solar, he met privately with Jasper Tuda and shared his anxieties. As the two men whispered about Margaret's destiny, snow whirled outside the arrow-slit windows. Killian was direct. He had witnessed such circumstances in the past, and they rarely ended well for either mother or child. They could try to flip the infant, but that may instantly kill both patients. Delays raised the risk of the child's death and Margaret's wariness. But they could try to wait and hope that nature would adjust the position. Alternatively, they may try a cesarean delivery, which was nearly always fatal for the mother. The horrible responsibility of making a decision for his sister-in-law fell on Jasper Tuda, who was only 25 years old. He, a younger son without any legal heirs of his own, would be the last in the Tuda line if Margaret passed away. The identical outcome would occur if she survived but lost the kid. Personal affection was just as important as the political ramifications. He had come to admire the bright, courageous girl who had handled widowhood so well. Margaret showed maturity beyond her years as her pregnancy developed during the gloomy winter months. She devoted her time to learning as much as she could about politics and statecraft, because she knew deep down that education would be her most powerful tool in the battles to come. Her brilliance and tenacity attracted Jasper Tuda, who took her under his wing to teach her survival skills. He taught her how to read people's faces, decipher the hidden meanings beneath diplomatic jargon, and comprehend the intricate web of friendships and rivalries that ruled aristocratic society. Additionally, Margaret immersed herself in religious studies with such fervor that it affected her attendance. She prayed in front of the altar for hours in the castle chapel until her knees were roaring and bleeding. She read theological materials, committed Latin prayers to memory, and cultivated a close, intimate relationship with God that would support her over decades of political conflict. According to some historians, her intense faith started as a coping strategy for the pain of child marriage and the approaching childbirth, a means of giving meaning to what otherwise appeared like pointless misery. Father Meredith, the castle's priest and a Welshman who attended Cambridge for his schooling before entering the ecclesiastical order, also played a significant role in Margaret's education. He was aware of both the practical politics of surviving in a violent world and the classical education of the colleges. Margaret learnt from him that God frequently used human agency. Prayer without action was meaningless, but prayer-driven action had the power to change the world. The aches that doubled Margaret over on that January night in 1457 AD marked the start of her labor. As part of the exercise prescribed by Carlian for her health, she had been strolling around the castle's battlements. She had never felt pain like that when the first contraction came. It was like a tearing, crushing sensation that seemed to divide her body in two. As her attendant ladies hurried to assist her in returning to her quarters, she collapsed against the stone ramparts, gasping. The midwives, who had seen ladies who had given birth to many children, looked at each other meaningfully. They had witnessed this before, a youngster attempting to conceive, nature being overpowered by political necessity and human ambition. Knowing that one or both of their patients might be dead before morning, they set up their tools and prayed. Dame Gwen Franken Davies was a head midwife with 30 years of experience in childbirth. She had inherited secrets passed down through generations of Welsh women, having learnt her skill from her own mother and grandmother. She was familiar with pain-relieving herbs, birth control methods, and prayers that appear to fortify laboring women. Her aged face, however, became solemn as she studied Margaret. With grim efficiency, the other midwives set up their instruments. Knives were available for both procedures, too dreadful to consider, and for severing the birth cord. There were holy relics to invoke divine intervention, medicines to fortify frail women, and hooks and forceps to remove deceased newborns. The smoke of burning herbs filled the room, lavender for relaxation, rosemary for fortitude, and other plants, whose qualities were only known to the women who attended to births and deaths. Margaret toiled in unfathomable pain for 18 hours, her cries echoing off the stone walls until there was only the sound of an animal moaning in misery. In an attempt to save mother and child, the midwives worked feverishly, their hands wet with blood. Dame Gwen employed every tactic in her extensive toolbox. Herbal medicines, massage, shifting positions, and unceasing support were spoken in Margaret's ear, knowing that the Lancastrian cause's future could be lost in that room. Jasper Tudor paced the hallways outside, his boots clicking against the stone flags. Through the heavy oak door, he could hear Margaret's screams, each one piercing him like a blade. With armfuls of fresh linen and basins of hot water, servants rushed by, their expressions conveying the seriousness of the situation. Father Meredith prayed continuously while kneeling in the chapel for the young lady whose life was on the verge of collapse. Margaret's power waned as daylight drew near. She had spent almost a whole day in labor. Her youthful physique went much beyond its capabilities. Dr. Carl woke up from his restless slumber, inspected her, and whispered urgently to Dame Gwen. The infant's heartbeat was weak and erratic, but it was alive and in distress. Margaret's skin was as pale as parchment. Her pulse was thready, and she was bleeding internally. It was decided to try manual extraction, a risky technique that could rescue the infant at the expense of the mother's life. Demwan had previously used the method, but never on a child this small. She secretly prayed to the patroness of childbirth, Saint Margaret of Antioch, while carefully positioning Margaret. When the baby eventually came out, ripped from Margaret's body in a procedure that almost killed her, the midwives held their breath as she reached within the young woman's body to guide the infant into the world. The baby was coated in blood and birth fluid, pallid and hardly breathing. Margaret's ragged breathing and the crackle of the fire in the hearth were the only sounds in the room for a horrifying moment. The sound that altered everything then filled the air as Dame Gwen cleaned the baby's throat and lips. Henry Tudor, the future King of England, was heralded by a slender, irate wail. Through a fog of anguish and fatigue, Margaret, almost awake, her young body broken by the experience, heard her son's first cry. Her arms refused to follow the instructions in her mind as she attempted to reach for him before hurrying the infant to the fire to be bathed and swaddled. Dame Gwen briefly placed him on Margaret's bosom, marking the customary first encounter between mother and child. Margaret's gaze followed the baby with intense desperation, learning every feature of his small face by heart. Margaret's body suffered serious and irreversible harm. In the days after the birth, Dr. Carl Cleon examined her and discovered severe tearing and internal injuries that would never completely heal. The doctor whispered of ripped flesh, organ damage, and blood loss that had almost killed him. She was never going to have another child. Her childbearing years had finished before they had official eben due to this one horrific birth. She was practically infertile at the age of 13. On the altar of dynastic politics, her reproductive life was sacrificed. Physically, the rehabilitation was excruciatingly slow. Margaret, plagued by infection and fever, hung on the edge of life for weeks. And strong wines, enriched with medicinal herbs, Dame Gwyn stayed at Margaret's side at all times, watching her condition and spooning broth between her cracked lips. The psychological healing process for Margaret was even more complicated. She cried and screamed in the wee hours of the morning due to nightmares brought on by the anguish of her encounter. She became extremely afraid of being touched, recoiling at the slightest touch from her attendant. The connection between her pain and her newborn son hampered her relationship with him. Despite her intense love for him, she could hardly bear to hug him without being overcome by flashbacks to his horrific delivery. Despite the fact that Margaret Beaufort's body was broken, her soul was unbroken. She began to exhibit the iron will and cunning wit that would make her one of the most powerful women in English history as she gradually recovered in the months after Henry's birth. Even in her frail state, she recognized that her son was the Lancastrian cause's future. She also realized that in a world on the verge of collapse, a landless widow with a newborn kid required protection. Around them, the Rose Wars were breaking out with ever-increasing violence. The First Battle of St. Albans in 1455 AD had declared that England will use sword and axe instead of diplomacy to resolve her dynastic conflicts. The battle between the Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York would engulf England's aristocracy for 30 years. The Lancastrians retained the throne through their lineage from Edward III's fourth son, John of Gaunt, while Richard, Duke of York, claimed it on the basis of his ancestry from the second son of Edward III, Margaret, with her Beaufort ancestry. Giving her Lancastrian blood was thus inherently associated with a cause that was fast losing support. Many people believed that Henry VI, the Lancastrian monarch, was feeble, probably mad, and undoubtedly incapable of ruling effectively. Margaret of Anjou, his queen, was more infamous, but also was competent. A foreign woman was held responsible for England's military setbacks in France and the country's descent into civil war. Remarrying was her answer. She married Sir Henry Stafford, the younger son of the Duke of Buckingham, in 1458 AD, just after Henry was born. Margaret's new spouse was a stranger chosen for political reasons rather than out of love, and she was still grieving and frail. More than his Yorkist sympathies, Stafford was a pragmatist who saw that defending Margaret meant defending the bloodlines and valuable Beaufort holdings, even though it meant sharing a bed with a man whose political allegiances ran against her own strongest beliefs. Margaret saw the marriage as a means of ensuring her and her son's protection. The arrangement served as a pragmatic solution to real-world issues and was more of a business partnership than a love relationship. The intricate political circumstances were reflected in the incredibly lengthy marriage contract that Stafford's father and Margaret's mother negotiated. Margaret would continue to be in charge of her Beaufort properties, guaranteeing the preservation of her son's inheritance. Stafford would shield the family's Lancastrian loyalties, politically and militarily. The clause that most likely saved the life of young Henry Tudor was that he would continue to be under the guardianship of Jasper Tudor in Wales, through some of the worst battles in English history. The couple's 14-year marriage to Stafford endured. The speed at which kings rose and fell was astounding. Edward IV was crowned, Henry V was overthrown, and Edward V triumphed once more. 4 individuals with dubious allegiances or precious bloodlines. Every shift in the throne carried fresh risks. Margaret became increasingly adept at negotiating these perilous waters. Knowing that female networks were frequently more resilient than male alliances, she developed ties with women on both sides of the battle. In her French exile, she kept secret correspondence with Margaret of Anjou and maintained regular correspondence with Elizabeth Woodville, the Queen of Edward IV. It took great diplomatic ability to maintain these partnerships. Treason charges could result from a single missing word. Henry, Margaret's son, was kept in Wales throughout these tumultuous years, under Jasper Tudor's guardianship. Although the agreement seemed sensible, Margaret found it to be devastating. Only under carefully negotiated circumstances would she see her only child, maybe once or twice a year. Raised by his uncle in the Welsh Highlands, Henry grew from baby to boy to young man, unfamiliar to his own mother, while she navigated the perilous waters of English royal politics. The separation was painful, yet essential. In order to send carefully coded letters that could get beyond enemy lines without disclosing sensitive information, Margaret used her frustrated parental impulses, books, clothes, and small mementos that may remind Henry of the mother he hardly knew were among the presents she sent whenever she could. She never knew whether her son was safe, healthy, or even alive, so she lived in a condition of perpetual fear most of the time. In Wales, Henry received a thorough and useful education. Jasper Tudor made sure his nephew learnt the more difficult survival skills, in addition to the more traditional aristocratic achievements such as riding, swordsmanship, music, and dance. Henry gained the loyalty of men who owed him nothing but respect, learnt to speak Welsh fluently, and became familiar with the rhythms of country life. When he eventually returned to take his kingdom, these lessons would be extremely helpful. Margaret's marriage to Stafford allowed her to complete her own schooling. She gained knowledge on how to run enormous estates, analyze financial statements, and comprehend the intricate network of responsibilities that held medieval society together. She studied history, theology, and law as assiduously as a university student would, developed into one of the best private collections in England. Everything changed once more in 1461 AD at the Battle of Towton. Edward IV prevailed handily, the bloodiest battle to ever take place in England. On Palm Sunday, the 29th of March, 1461 AD, an estimated 50,000 men gathered on a snow-covered pitch in Yorkshire. By evening, about half of them had perished. The leadership of the Lancastrian cause was either dead or dispersed, and the cause was in ruins. Margaret of Anjou set out for France with her baby son, Edward of Westminster, while Henry viffled to Scotland. Margaret found herself in a new and perilous predicament as a result of 210. Although Edward IV was suspicious of Elizabeth due to her Lancastrian ancestry, she was somewhat shielded by her marriage to Stafford. More perilously, her baby boy. in Wales could serve as a focal point for Lancastrian opposition. Edward IV has already shown that he was prepared to put adversaries to death. Would he have that rule apply to kids as well? Margaret worried about if soldiers would come for Henry and whether she would wake up one day to find out her son had died. In order to stay ahead of probable dangers, she created a complex intelligence network, bribing clerks for copies of royal communications and paying servants and merchants for news from Wales. Although the never-ending attention to detail was draining, it saved her son's life. Infected gash in his thigh, which left him partially paralyzed and made him more resentful of his involvement in the Yorkist cause. Despite putting his life in danger for Edward IV, he got little credit or compensation. He was so disappointed that he was susceptible to Margaret's subtle persuasion. During her husband's grueling months of recuperation, Margaret took advantage of the opportunity to gradually change his political allegiance. She didn't ever openly support the Lancastrian cause. The risk would have been too great. Told Stafford about the ineptitude and corruption of the Yorkists, and eventually persuaded him that his devotion had not been sufficiently rewarded. Extraordinary psychological talent was needed for the process. Stafford's innate caution, personal gratitude for Edward IV's generosity, and years of Yorkist loyalty were all obstacles Margaret had to overcome. She accomplished this by carefully manipulating his wounded pride, being patient, and repeating the process. Stafford was prepared to change sides by 1470 AD, when the Earl of Warwick started his uprising against Edward IV. The political kaleidoscope changed once more in 1470 AD after a falling out with Edward IV. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker, sided with Margaret of Anjou to put Henry VI back on the throne. It was an odd alliance. After years of fighting against Henry VIII and placing Edward IV on the throne, Warwick's wounded pride transcended his past allegiances. However, politics made for odd bedfellows. With great attention and increasing optimism, Margaret observed these events. Maybe her son may return from exile in Wales if Henry VI was reinstated and the Lancastrian cause won. She started cautiously contacting other Lancastrian supporters in an attempt to spark a possible rebellion. These communications were extremely risky. For everyone concerned, discovery would entail death. For Margaret, the restoration of Henry VI in October 1470 AD was a miracle. To escape, Edward IV went to Burgundy. When Henry VI was escorted from the Tower of London and solemnly reinstated on his throne, his brother Richard of Gloucester was by his side. The unfortunate Mad King appeared, perplexed by the development. In March of 1471 AD, Edward IV returned from exile, accompanied by a small army of seasoned mercenaries and Burgundian assistants. He acted swiftly, winning over nobility who were fed up with the confusion and unpredictability. On April 14, 1471 AD, the pivotal battle took place at Barnet when Warwick lost his life in combat. The Lancastrian cause was permanently destroyed at Tewkesbury 2 weeks later. On May 4, 1471 AD, everything changed in 1471 AD. The Lancastrian cause was ultimately defeated at the Battle of Tewkesbury, and Edward, Prince of Wales, the last direct heir to Henry VI's throne, lost his life. According to some tales, the prince was killed after being caught, although he died in the conflict. His passing put an end to the direct Lancastrian line, as did Henry Vy's own unexplained disappearance. Soon after, Margaret's teenage son was suddenly one of the most dangerous individuals in England, and the strongest contender for the Lancastrian succession. He traced his claim back via the Beaufort line, but it was convoluted by doubts about its legitimacy that had been voiced for years. However, those who opposed Yorkist authority began to view Henry Tudor's claim as more and more important, since there were no direct Lancastrian successors. Jasper Tudor took a snap decision after realizing that Henry's life was in imminent danger. Instead of risking the boy's capture and likely execution, he would exile him. It was a painful but essential decision. Exile meant leaving behind everything and everyone Henry had ever known, and remaining in Wales meant death. Henry Tudor, at 14 years old, set sail for 14 years of exile in Brittany on a ship in Tenby, on a storm-lashed night in September of 1471 AD. It was a hasty and perilous departure. The remaining Lancastrian castles in Wales were coming under attack from Yorkist armies. Before enemy soldiers reached Pembroke Castle, Henry and Jasper might have had an hour's notice. When her son left, Margaret wasn't there. It wasn't until a few days later that she realized her child was running for his life in England. She was shocked beyond belief when the news finally reached her. She and Henry had been separated by the distance of Wales for 14 years. The English Channel and international animosity now separated them. It was impossible for her to predict whether she would ever see him again. Thought that she might have lost everything she held dear. She had lost her kid, perhaps forever. As Edward IV solidified his win and started to make amends with his adversaries, her own position became more and more vulnerable. With a heart that had hardened into something more durable than steel, Margaret returned to England and her union with Henry Stafford. She would be something else, totally, if she couldn't be a mother in the conventional sense. She was a survivor, a strategist, and a lady who would dedicate the remainder of her life to placing her exiled son on the English throne. Cold, calculating ambition replaced the anguish of separation. It was amazing to see the transformation. But now they were faced with a powerful political manipulator who seemed to anticipate 3 moves ahead in every circumstance. She started establishing support systems around England, finding aristocrats who may be convinced to back her son's eventual comeback. Although the work was demanding and hazardous, it provided her with a sense of purpose. Although Stafford's health had deteriorated since his battle injury, his passing coincided with Margaret's incredibly advantageous political ploy. It's uncertain if he died from natural causes, poisoning, or just plain stress. Margaret, who had already been widowed twice and was now getting close to 30, had to make a big decision regarding her 3rd marriage. She went with power instead. One of England's most politically astute aristocrats, Thomas Stanley, Lord Stanley, was her 3rd marriage. The game that had devastated so many others was mastered by Stanley. His speciality was switching allegiances at the last second, always ending up on the right side of any fight, since he was particularly good at it. And his family commanded sizable military forces in northwest England. By forming an alliance with Stanley, Margaret gained access to military resources, political clout, and intelligence networks that could one day be vital to her son's cause. Stanley gained ties within the nobility and the prestige of Beaufort blood through his marriage to Margaret. Despite being a partnership of convenience, the marriage worked incredibly well. In order to declare Margaret's ongoing significance, despite her son's exile, the wedding ceremony was lavish by the standards of the era. Nobles from all around England attended the 3-day celebrations, which included dinners, religious services, and tournaments. Perhaps realizing that it was preferable to have the dangerous Margaret Beaufort in the open rather than working in the background, Edward IV himself went. The terms of the marriage contract were intricate and meticulously worked out. Was still able to manage her Beaufort properties and follow her son's wishes. Stanley acquired a wife whose connections and knowledge enhanced his own political acumen. Both realized that as Stanley's wife, Margaret kept in touch with exiles and possible supporters, while also obtaining information on royal policies. Stanley gave her actions cover, while establishing his own base of influence in case of future disputes. Henry Tudor, meanwhile, was maturing into a man in exile in Brittany. Although Duke Francis II ruled the Duchy of Brittany, which was formally independent, it was torn between the conflicting demands of England and France. There, Henry was in a vulnerable situation. He was hazardous as a focal point for English opposition to Edward IV, but he was also useful as a possible ally or negotiating chip. As the years went by, mother-son correspondence grew increasingly rare and meticulously coded. To communicate, they employed complex codes, invisible inks, and fictitious names. Messages regarding commercial or family difficulties were concealed in what appeared to be innocent correspondence. Although the technology was faulty and unwieldy, it kept Henry's court in exile, connected to Margaret's intelligence network in England. Margaret was always afraid that her son was dead, that York had hired assassins to kill him, or that he had just been killed by illness or accident in a faraway country. Perhaps the ignorance was worse than the inevitable disaster. In order to get information from Brittany, merchants, pilgrims, ambassadors, and anybody else who had seen her son or heard of his well-being, she established a complex network of informants. Margaret created an intelligence network of exceptional size and sophistication. Throughout England and the continent, she had informants in noble homes, monastic houses, merchant guilds, and royal palaces. Professional spies would have been impressed by the network of covert communications that brought information to her. She kept tabs on the health and allegiances of possible allies and foes, heard court rumors before the monarch did, and was aware of military movements before some commanders were. In April of 1483 AD, Edward IV passed away suddenly, leaving his 12-year-old son, Edward V, to succeed to the kingdom. Although unexpected, the king's death was not wholly unexpected. He had led a rough life, consuming excessive amounts of food and alcohol, and his health had been deteriorating for years. But because a child monarch needed a regency that could easily turn into a dictatorship, his death at the age of 40 sent the country into an instant crisis. However, the young monarch would never be crowned. Even England's bloodthirsty nobility was horrified by the revolt that took power and installed his uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Never to be seen alive again, young Edward V and his brother Richard vanished into the Tower of London. Although Richard III was anointed king in July of 1483 AD, suspicion would follow him throughout his reign. Margaret saw Richard's usurpation as a once-in-a-lifetime chance, as well as a grave peril. Yorkist legitimacy had been undermined by Richard's takeover. In contrast to a monarch who was suspected of killing children, Henry Tudor's remote claim through the Beaufort line now seemed like a realistic option. With astounding boldness, Margaret started to scheme, using Bishop John Morton and other exiles as conduits. She arranged for her son to invade from Brittany and organized a rebellion within England. Perfect timing, substantial funding, and communications over hundreds of miles of hostile area were all necessary for the conspiracy. When Henry's intended invasion was revealed through treachery, the rebellion fell in October of 1483 AD. Margaret was horrified to see her fellow accomplices put to death. She was put under house arrest and had her titles revoked, but she only managed to avoid death because she was married to Stanley. Margaret, however, was not defeated. She continued to scheme using coded letters and dependable staff even after being arrested. She devoted months to arranging not just her son's comeback, but also his prosperous reign as king. Margaret's painstaking grooming of the Stanley family paid off in August 1485 when Henry eventually invaded at Milford Haven. On August 22, 1485 AD, Richard III lost his life in battle in the mud of Learshire at Bosworth Field, in a betrayal. Margaret had carefully planned over years of manipulation. The Stanley forces that were supposed to stand behind Richard instead turned against him. England was ruled by her son, Henry. I had one after 14 years of exile, 28 years of separation, and decades of painstaking preparation. The straightforward mother-child bond that had been taken from her by political necessity was never again enjoyed by Margaret, who rose to become the most powerful woman in England. Margaret lived to witness her son create the Tudor dynasty, wed Elizabeth of York to bring the warring houses together, and bear Henry VIII, the prince. After completing an arc of ambition that started in the blood-soaked birthing chamber at Pembroke Castle, she passed away in 1509 AD, a few days after Henry VII was crowned. There is no easy way to quantify the price of Margaret's accomplishment. She gave up her motherhood due to political necessity, her happiness to dynastic ambition, and her body to provide England with a king. The 13-year-old girl who screamed in labor at Pembroke Castle could never have anticipated being the king's mother, the dynasty's founder, the woman who used maternal love to stop the Wars of the Roses, and the woman who became political gold. Visitors can read the Latin inscription that encapsulates Margaret Bowett's life of great achievement based on extraordinary sacrifice in Westminster Abbey, where she rests in her black marble grave. However, they are unable to hear the echoes of that long-ago cry, the sound of a kid in pain that will shape England's destiny. That voice and the tale it started are still buried within the stone walls of a Welsh castle, where the wind still howls through the old stones and the Atlantic waves still smash against the cliffs, whispering about a girl who became a queen mother after enduring hardships no child should ever have to go through. If you enjoyed this journey through history, make sure to subscribe to History Nest, where every night a new story takes flight.